Right now, you are looking at a single cabbage that can become months of food, not weeks, months, and the technique that makes it possible is the same one that kept entire villages alive through winter long before refrigeration ever existed. It requires no electricity, no freezer, no canning pressure cooker, just one rule that, if you break it, spoils everything. And once you understand that rule, you will know exactly why this jar of fermented cabbage is safer than anything you can buy at the store. This jar of sauerkraut holds a secret that grocery stores forgot. A single cabbage costs less than $2. With one rule and 5 minutes of work, it becomes food that stays safe without a refrigerator for months. The same method that fueled Roman soldiers and German peasants through famine. And the reason most people are afraid to try it is the very thing that makes it impossible to fail. The method is called lacto-fermentation. It is older than writing, older than agriculture, older than every food technology in your kitchen combined. Before freezers, before pressure canners, before refrigerated trucks that bring you produce from 1,500 miles away, there was a crock, some salt, and time. Roman legionaries carried fermented cabbage in clay pots on marches across Germania. Captain Cook sailed with 60 barrels of sauerkraut, and not a single sailor died of scurvy, while the British Navy was losing men by the thousands. German peasants stored it in root cellars that never got above 50 degrees, and entire families ate from the same crock until the spring thaw brought fresh greens again. They didn't do this out of tradition. They did it because it worked. Because this single process, this one ratio, was the difference between having food in February and starving. And the reason your grandparents probably never taught you how to do it has nothing to do with safety. It has to do with convenience. When refrigeration arrived in every home, the old knowledge was left in the cellar, with the crock. But here is what no food manufacturer wants you to notice. The sauerkraut you buy in the store today is dead. They heat it to kill everything inside, including the living bacteria that actually keep your gut working. They pasteurize fermentation itself. You are paying $5 for a jar of dead cabbage floating in vinegar when the living version costs pennies and builds a shelf-stable food that lasts the entire winter. The whole thing hinges on one rule, one ratio that, if you get it right, cannot fail. 2 to 2.5% salt by weight. That is 20 grams of salt for every 1,000 grams of shredded cabbage. It is not a pinch. It is not a teaspoon. It is a scale on your counter and a number that must be exact. Because salt is not seasoning here. Salt is the gatekeeper. If you use too little, the wrong bacteria wake up. You get soft, slimy cabbage that rots. If you use too much, the right bacteria go dormant and nothing ferments. But inside that narrow window, something ancient activates. The salt pulls water from the cabbage cells, creating its own brine. The brine immediately drowns the bacteria that need oxygen, and into that sealed, submerged world, the lactobacillus wake up. They feast on the sugars in the cabbage and spit out lactic acid. The pH drops. Day by day, the jar becomes a fortress no pathogen can enter. Below 4.6 pH, botulism cannot form. Below 4.0, even molds surrender. Your refrigerator sits at around 40 degrees and slows spoilage. This jar becomes its own preservative. It does not need cold. The method is called lacto-fermentation. It is older than writing, older than agriculture, older than every food technology in your kitchen combined. Before freezers, before pressure canners, before refrigerated trucks that bring you produce from 1,500 miles away, there was a crock, some salt and time. Roman legionaries carried fermented cabbage in clay pots on marches across Germania. Captain Cook sailed with 60 barrels of sauerkraut, and not a single sailor died of scurvy. While the British Navy was losing men by the thousands, German peasants stored it in root cellars that never got above 50 degrees, and entire families ate from the same crock until the spring thaw brought fresh greens again. They didn't do this out of tradition. They did it because it worked. Because this single process, this one ratio, was the difference between having food in February and starving. And the reason your grandparents probably never taught you how to do it has nothing to do with safety. It has to do with convenience. When refrigeration arrived in every home, the old knowledge was left in the cellar with the crock. But here is what no food manufacturer wants you to notice. The sauerkraut you buy in the store today is dead. They heat it to kill everything inside, including the living bacteria that actually keep your gut working. They pasteurize fermentation itself. You are paying $5 for a jar of dead cabbage floating in vinegar, when the living version costs pennies and builds a shelf-stable food that lasts the entire winter. The whole thing hinges on one rule, one ratio that, if you get it right, cannot fail: 2 to 2.5% salt by weight. That is 20 grams of salt for every 1,000 grams of shredded cabbage. It is not a pinch. It is not a teaspoon. It is a scale on your counter, and a number that must be exact. Because salt is not seasoning here. Salt is the gatekeeper. If you use too little, the wrong bacteria wake up. You get soft, slimy cabbage that rots. If you use too much, the right bacteria go dormant and nothing ferments. But inside that narrow window, something ancient activates. The salt pulls water from the cabbage cells, creating its own brine. The brine immediately drowns the bacteria that need oxygen. And into that sealed, submerged world, the lactobacillus wake up. They feast on the sugars in the cabbage and spit out lactic acid. The pH drops. Day by day, the jar becomes a fortress. No pathogen can enter. Below 4.6 pH, botulism cannot form. Below 4.0, even molds surrender. Your refrigerator sits at around 40 degrees and slows spoilage. This jar becomes its own preservative. It does not need cold. And yet there is a moment that terrifies every beginning fermenter. A moment you need to know is coming, because if you misinterpret it, you will throw away perfectly safe food, and you will never try again. It usually starts on day 3. You walk into the kitchen. You glance at the jar on the counter, and something is different. The brine has clouded. The cabbage has gone slightly pale. A thin white film is spreading across the surface, and your first thought is mold. Your second thought is, I am going to poison my family. And if you are like most people who try fermentation once, you open the lid, you smell it, and you pour the entire jar down the drain before breakfast. You have just thrown away perfectly safe food, and the reason you did is because nobody taught you what real fermentation looks like. So your brain fills the gap with the only frame it has: rot. Rot is what happens when food is dead. Fermentation is what happens when food is alive and defending itself. The white film is not mold. It is a harmless yeast called kahm that forms on the surface of almost every vegetable ferment in the first week. It cannot hurt you. It tastes slightly bitter, so you skim it off with a spoon and keep going. The cloudiness in the brine is dead bacterial cells, the lactobacillus generations that lived fast and died fast and left behind an ever-thickening shield of lactic acid. The smell, the one that hits your nose the moment you lift the lid, is sulfur. Cabbage is a cruciferous vegetable. same family as broccoli and kale. During the first few days of fermentation, sulfur compounds are released as the plant cells break down. Utah State University Extension calls it a rotten odor, and then tells you directly, do not throw it out. It will disappear in a few days as fermentation continues. The window of stink is temporary. By day 5, the sulfur is gone. By day 7, the jar smells clean and sharp and slightly sour, the scent of a living food that has finished building its own security system. And that security system is measurable. Every day, the pH drops. On day 1, your cabbage and salt mixture sits around 6.5, neutral enough for all kinds of bacteria to be interested. By day 3, the lactobacillus have pushed it to around 4.8, already below the botulism threshold, but still accessible to molds. By day 5, you are at 4.2. By day 7, around 3.7. That number is a death sentence for every pathogen that can harm a human being. You do not need a refrigerator when your food is swimming in acid. It produced itself. You do not need a preservative when the preservative is the liquid. You are not canning food. You are keeping food alive, and the only thing that can stop it working is you doing something the old fermenters knew never to do. Let air in. That is the rule. The one rule. If the cabbage is submerged beneath the brine, nothing can grow that will hurt you. The moment a piece of cabbage floats up and sits in the air at the top of the jar, you have opened the door to mold. Real mold, greenish-blue specks that mean throw it out. A single strip of cabbage above the brine line. A forgotten fleck of shredded leaf clinging to the glass. And your jar is vulnerable. That is why the old crocks had weights. Stones boiled clean and set on top of the cabbage to hold it down. A plate that fit inside the vessel. A bag filled with extra brine to form a seal. The Amish still use wooden boards cut to the diameter of the crock. They know the rule that every fermenter on earth once knew. Under the brine, safe. Above the brine, danger. It is that simple. Now, you might be standing in your kitchen right now with a cabbage on the cutting board and a jar waiting. And you might be thinking, this is the part where it gets complicated. It does not. The entire process, from knife to shelf, comes down to 5 steps that take less time than boiling a pot of water. And the exact ratio that makes it safe is so specific, it removes all guesswork. Here is exactly how it works. You core the cabbage, you slice it into ribbons thinner than your pinky finger, and you weigh it on a kitchen scale. Every gram matters. For a typical 2-pound head, that is around 900 grams of shredded cabbage, you multiply by 0.022, 20 grams of salt, not iodized salt. The iodine in table salt slows the bacteria, giving mold a head start. Sea salt, kosher salt, pickling salt, anything without anti-caking agents or iodine. You sprinkle the salt over the shreds. You massage it with your hands for 5 minutes until the cabbage goes from stiff to floppy, from dry to swimming in its own liquid. That is the brine forming. It will happen every time, because cabbage is over 90% water, and salt is the trigger. You pack it into a wide-mouthed jar, pressing down with your fist after every handful. No air pockets. Every shred must be beneath the surface. A clean cabbage leaf folded on top holds down the floaters. A glass weight or a small jar filled with water keeps the whole thing submerged. You screw the lid on loosely, because gas needs to escape. In the first few days, the jar will bubble like a slow lava lamp. That is carbon dioxide. The lactobacillus are breathing, eating, multiplying, and they do not want air any more than you do. You have just built the perfect environment for the only bacteria that can survive in it, on purpose. Now you wait, and the temperature of your kitchen decides everything that happens next. If you keep the jar at 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, the kraut finishes in 3 to 4 weeks. At 60 to 65, 5 to 6 weeks. Below 60, the bacteria go dormant and the cabbage just sits there. Below 50, fermentation stops completely. The Germans did not have central heating. They stored their crocks in the cool pantry and understood that winter sauerkraut took longer but lasted longer. The warmer the ferment, the faster the acid builds, but also the softer the texture. This is the second rule you were never told. Salt keeps the bad bacteria out. Temperature determines who wins the race inside the jar. But there is a moment in that waiting window that changes everything about what you think you are making. You are not just preserving cabbage. You are breeding a living colony of beneficial microbes that modern science is only beginning to understand. 1 tablespoon of fully fermented raw sauerkraut contains more probiotic organisms than an entire bottle of store-bought capsules. The lactic acid bacteria in the jar are the same strains that dominate a healthy human gut. Lactobacillus plantarum, Leuconostoc mesenteroides, Lactobacillus brevis. Names that sound like medical textbooks because they are. The University of Connecticut did not study hemp biodiesel this time. They studied the microbiome shift when people ate fermented vegetables daily, and the number they found was a 10-fold increase in anti-inflammatory gut flora populations. You are not making a condiment. You are manufacturing medicine from a $2 cabbage, and the fermentation vessel on your counter is the cleanest pharmaceutical lab you will ever own. But that is only true if you never heat it. The sauerkraut in the grocery store aisle, the one in the shelf-stable jar with the bright yellow label, was cooked after fermentation, pasteurized at 160 degrees until every living bacteria was dead. They killed the medicine to make it legal to sell unrefrigerated. They traded shelf life for healing, and they never put that trade on the label. You are paying for a jar of probiotic corpses and vinegar dressing, and the taste is so far from what real fermentation produces that you have probably never tasted real sauerkraut in your life, unless you made it yourself. Now, before you open that jar on week 4 and raise a fork to your mouth, there is one final thing you need to see, because the exact moment of readiness is not on a calendar. It is a signal your nose and tongue already know how to read, and once someone shows you the trick, you will never forget it. The trick is this: when the bubbling stops, you do not wait for a date. You taste it. The first thing that hits your tongue is acid, bright, clean, not harsh like vinegar, but round and mellow like the tang of a perfectly ripe lemon. The cabbage shreds have softened, but they still crackle between your teeth. The salt has faded from a distinct grain to a gentle warmth in the background. Fermentation is not like baking. There is no wrong minute. You are the only clock that matters. If it tastes right, it is right. If it needs more time, you screw the lid back on and wait another week, and you can taste it safely, because unlike a can of beans or a jar of pickles processed with heat, this food never passed through a temperature that kills the organisms protecting it. The pH is the guard. Remember the number 4.6. Botulism cannot form below it. Your sauerkraut is resting at 3.5. It is not only safe, it is safer than the raw cabbage you started with. Any green or blue fuzz on the surface means you lost the submerged rule. But if all the cabbage stayed under the brine, there is nothing alive in that jar that can hurt you. That is not a guess. That is 80 years of food microbiology from the USDA and every extension university in America. Now here is the part nobody believes until they live it. Once fermented, you move this jar to a cold place, a basement, a pantry in winter, or your refrigerator. Unpasteurized sauerkraut stored at 40 degrees or below will hold for 4 to 6 months, with peak crunch and flavor, but safe stretches beyond that. 8 months, 9 months, even a year, if the temperature stays low. The acid does not let go. The brine is a cryogenic chamber for food. When German peasants pulled their last cabbage of the season from the crock in March, it had been sitting since October with no ice, no electricity, no power. The only guarantee was the acid they had grown themselves. You eat it 3 ways. The first is straight from the jar, a forkful before dinner, because the enzymes in raw kraut prime your stomach for everything that follows. The second is alongside fatty meat, a pork chop, a sausage, a slice of roast duck. The acid cuts through the richness like a knife. The third is cooked. Toss a handful into a pot of soup just before serving or fold it into mashed potatoes. Heat kills the probiotics, but the flavor stays. You are trading gut bacteria for a deep, savory note that no spice alone can reach. But the real secret, the one they never print on a recipe card, is the brine left behind when the cabbage is gone. That amber liquid is a potent tonic, full of the same lactic acid and live cultures that fermented the cabbage in the first place. A shot in the morning resets digestion. A splash in a marinade tenderizes meat. A spoonful replaces vinegar in salad dressing. People pay $30 a bottle for shots of fermented juice at health stores. You just poured one from a jar that cost you $2. I will link the full ratios, the pH chart, and the exact weight I use in the description. But before you eat your first forkful, I need to warn you about the one place in your kitchen you should never put this jar, because a single mistake there can undo months of patience, and almost every new fermenter makes it. That place is the refrigerator. You put the jar in cold too early, and the bacteria fall asleep before they have built the acid wall. The pH never drops below 4.6. You waited 3 weeks, and in the final stretch, you cracked the door for the very organisms you were trying to keep out. Let the jar finish its work at room temperature. A crock on the counter is not a mistake. It is the oldest food safety system in human history, and the reason we forgot it has nothing to do with progress and everything to do with profit. Dead kraut can sit unrefrigerated on a grocery shelf for years. Living kraut cannot, so the industry killed it and called the dead version normal. You just learned how to resurrect what they buried. 1 cabbage, 1 jar, 1 ratio, all winter. Not because a corporation told you it was safe, but because you understood the rule that made it safe yourself. If this video made sense to you, there is a special offer waiting for you through the link in the first pinned comment. Hit subscribe, not for the algorithm, for the next jar.